Sometimes the most painful truths don't arrive through rumors, they appear on a screen you wish you'd never seen. She thought she was doing a kind thing, secretly repairing her struggling daughter's broken laptop as a surprise. But when the technician called her back, his face was pale and his voice low. He asked if she was alone. Then he told her to cancel her bank cards, change her locks, and contact the authorities immediately. Confused and terrified, she asked why. He simply turned the laptop toward her. And there, in cold words and careful plans, was something she never imagined her own child would write about her. A betrayal so calculated, it made her question everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and motherhood. My name is Lorraine. I am 61 years old, and my world has always been small but steady. I work part-time at a local library, come home to my plants and radio, and end my evenings with tea and the occasional phone call from my daughter. Things haven't always been easy for her, money worries, unstable jobs, but I've tried to help where I can. Love, to me, has always meant showing up quietly. I believed we trusted one another, even when life pressed hard. So when her old laptop finally gave out, I saw it not as a problem, but as an opportunity to surprise her with kindness. I had no idea that decision would open a door I can never unsee again. She had been under pressure for months. Rent late, bills stacking up. Friendships are fading. Each phone call carried a new wave of stress, and sometimes her voice sounded like someone clinging to a rope that was slowly fraying. She tried to joke about it, but the laughter never reached her eyes anymore. I helped when I could, groceries here, a little cash there, always careful not to make her feel small. Still, there was a distance forming between us, thin at first, then heavier. I told myself it was just adulthood settling in, that independence sometimes looks like distance. I didn't see the warning signs for what they were. Not yet. The call came one evening. Panic, frustration, tears buried under anger. The laptop had stopped working completely, right when she needed it most. She said she'd figure something out, but I knew that meant going without food or sleep to cover the cost. After we hung up, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then I made a quiet decision. I asked her to drop the laptop off just in case my friend knew someone. She did, relieved but embarrassed, and I promised to keep it simple. To her, it was a kind gesture. To me, it felt like finally being useful again. The next morning, I tucked the laptop into my tote bag like it was fragile glass and took the bus to a small repair shop recommended by a neighbor. The technician was young but patient, the kind who explains things gently. I told him only that my daughter couldn't afford repairs and I wanted to surprise her. He smiled, said he'd see what he could do, and asked me to come back in a few days. I left feeling lighter, imagining her face when I handed it back working again. A mother lives for moments like that, those tiny victories that make all the worry worth it. I didn't know that kindness was walking me straight toward the truth. When the shop called, the tone in his voice was different. Not cheerful, careful. He asked if I could come in alone. My stomach tightened, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the repair was just expensive. Maybe it couldn't be fixed. When I arrived, he locked the register, guided me to a small desk in the back, and asked if I felt safe at home. The question was so unexpected I actually laughed, then stopped when I saw his expression. He turned the laptop toward me and said there were things I needed to see. Not gossip, not assumptions, just messages and a pattern that suggested I should cancel my cards and change the locks immediately. He spoke gently, choosing every word with care. He said he wasn't accusing anyone, only that what he'd found suggested someone had access to my personal information and had been discussing plans that involved me directly. Out of respect, he avoided details, but the implication was terrifying. My hands went cold. My heart thudded so loudly I could barely hear him. He suggested contacting the proper authorities, documenting everything, and making sure I wasn't alone while sorting it out. I stared at the screen, at familiar words typed in my daughter's tone, and something inside me cracked. Kindness has brought me here. Love had uncovered this. And now I couldn't unsee any of it. I didn't shout, I didn't faint. I simply went very, very still. The technician asked if I wanted to look away, but I owed it to myself and painfully to her to understand. So I nodded. We scrolled quietly, the room shrinking around us. Each line confirmed what my heart already sensed. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was intentional, planned, discussed, and I was at the center of it. When I finally stood to leave, my legs trembled. I thanked him for his honesty and stepped into the afternoon light that suddenly felt dimmer than night. Love doesn't disappear in a moment like that, but trust does. And the first step towards staying safe is admitting the truth, no matter how much it hurts. She sat across from the technician as he carefully opened a folder of saved messages. They weren't dramatic or loud, no all caps rage or cruelty. That somehow made them worse. Calm conversations, careful wording, discussions about access, accounts, and information that only someone close to her would know. She felt her chest tight as she read the tone, coldly practical, like she was a problem to be solved rather than a mother to be loved. There were hints of money troubles, of desperation. But there was also planning, intention, lines that made her hands tremble as she scrolled. The technician kept his voice soft, reminding her she didn't have to keep reading, but she did, because once you sense the truth, looking away does not make it disappear. As the messages continued, the shape of the situation became clear, not in specific steps, but in purpose. She saw conversations pointing toward ways to access what little she had, mentions of timing, mentions of secrecy, mentions of her. There were also drafts she had never been meant to see, words so detached they barely sounded human. It felt like standing in a familiar house and suddenly realizing the floorboards were hollow. This wasn't a passing thought. It was something that had been explored, discussed, refined. She pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. Love didn't vanish, but it fractured painfully under the weight of reality. Shock is quiet. It sits in the body like ice. She walked home in a daze, clutching her bag, barely aware of traffic or voices around her. How do you reconcile the child you once rocked to sleep with the stranger behind those words? Grief swept through her in waves, grief for the relationship she thought she had, grief for the trust that now lay shattered at her feet. Anger flickered too, but it wasn't hot. It was heavy. She spent that night at the kitchen table, staring at the wall, whispering to herself that she would handle this carefully, safely. Kindly where possible, but firmly where necessary. The next day, she reached out to the proper authorities, not to punish, but to protect. She brought only facts, not emotion. What she had seen, when, where the laptop came from. They listened with steady professionalism, asked measured questions, and guided her toward the correct next steps. She felt small sitting in that office chair, like a child called to the principal, but slowly relief seeped in. She wasn't alone. She didn't have to untangle this herself. The situation, they said, would be reviewed carefully. Her safety was the priority now. That sentence wrapped around her like a blanket she hadn't known she needed. Once everything was explained, the reality sank in. This wasn't just emotional betrayal. There were real-world risks, real consequences, real danger if she ignored the warning signs. She thought of her front door, her cards, her privacy. All the ways someone you love has silent access to your life, the kind you never question until you must. For the first time, her home didn't feel like a refuge. It felt exposed, and that broke her heart almost as much as the laptop screen had. Nights became the hardest. She would lie awake listening to the house settle, every creak suddenly sounding louder, closer. Her mind replayed the messages on a loop. She wasn't afraid of shadows or strangers. She was afraid of misplaced trust. Of what desperation can turn someone into. She cried sometimes, not loud sobs, just silent tears that slipped across the pillow. And yet, beneath the fear, something else was growing too. Resolve. She would not collapse. She would not scream or panic or lash out. She would move with care, with support. With truth, she began to make small, calm changes, the kind that builds safety without inviting confrontation. She checked the paperwork. She secured what mattered. She let a few trusted people know she might need support without sharing details that weren't hers to spread. Everything she did was steady, lawful, and gentle, but unmistakably protective. Love may have been wounded, but self-respect was waking up. And late one evening, as she sat in the dim kitchen with a warm mug between her hands, she whispered a sentence she had never spoken before. I can love her and still protect myself from her choices. And that truth, painful as it was, became the foundation for everything that came next. She started to understand that the situation hadn't grown overnight. Her daughter had been drowning quietly for a long time beneath bills, mistakes, and choices that kept backfiring. There were messages full of panic, fear, and resentment, not at first about her, but about life itself. She saw how shame had twisted into desperation, how asking for help had slowly turned into searching for shortcuts. None of it excused anything, but it painted a clearer picture of a young woman who felt trapped in a corner with no way out. That realization layered the pain with sorrow. A mother's heart can break and still ache for the person who broke it. Buried in the conversations were other voices, people feeding her daughter half-truths, telling her that survival sometimes meant crossing lines. They praised manipulation as strategy, urged secrecy, and framed selfishness as empowerment. Reading those words felt like watching strangers guide her child down a dark hallway. Her daughter wasn't blameless, but she also wasn't alone in the path she had chosen. Influence is powerful, especially when someone is scared and feels unseen. That was another wound she hadn't expected. The realization that the world had been whispering into her daughter's ear, while she believed love alone was enough protection. Slowly, memory stitched itself together into an uncomfortable truth. There had been signs. Small financial emergencies that never resolved. Missing mail, sudden mood swings when money comes up, avoidance, defensiveness. She had explained each one away because that's what love often does. It builds gentle stories to protect the heart from breaking. Sitting with those memories now, she refused to hate herself for missing them. Parents don't expect danger to come from the child they once rocked to sleep. Trust isn't foolish. It's simply the promise we hope love keeps. She also began to see the longer shadow patterns that had echoed quietly through the family for years. Silence instead of honesty. Avoidance instead of accountability. Money used as a measure of safety rather than a tool. Her daughter had grown up watching people struggle in private rather than seek help, and somewhere along the line, survival had turned into secrecy. It didn't excuse the betrayal, but it explained the roots. Pain rarely begins where it lands. Her heart lived in two worlds at once. In one, she was terrified, aware that someone she loved had gathered the tools to harm her trust and her life. In the other, she still saw the little girl who used to fall asleep on her shoulder. Love and fear wrapped around each other so tightly she could barely breathe. Some days she wanted to hold her child and ask what had gone wrong. Other days, she needed space just to steady her hands. Healing, she realized, would never mean pretending this hadn't happened. It would mean learning how to love safely, even when the love was complicated. With professional guidance, she documented what she needed to carefully, quietly, without confrontation. Every step she took was calm and lawful, guided by people who understood how to keep everyone safe. It wasn't about trapping anyone. It was about truth. She created a record so the situation could be understood clearly should it ever be questioned. Staying composed became her act of self-protection. Panic helps no one. Clarity protects everyone. The final shift came when she stopped asking why this was happening and started asking what she needed to stay safe. That subtle change gave her strength. She took every protective step recommended to her, not loudly, not dramatically, just firmly. She surrounded herself with trusted people and allowed herself to accept support instead of trying to be endlessly strong. It was the first time in years she chose herself without apology. And while the heartbreak didn't disappear, a new sense of steadiness took root. She could not rewrite what had been discovered, but she could ensure the story didn't end with regret for the warning she chose to ignore. When the time finally came, she didn't raise her voice or accuse wildly. She simply sat at a small table with a support person present and explained what had been discovered, how it had been documented, and why safety now had to come first. The words shook, but they were steady. Her daughter's face went through a maze of emotions: shock, anger, fear, deflection, before landing in silence. She didn't argue, she didn't attack, she just said that lines had been crossed and could never be stepped over again. Pain filled the room like smoke, but so did clarity. Truth had finally been spoken aloud, not to shame, but to stop the damage from growing. The wider family reacted in every direction at once. Some wept for what had happened, some demanded explanations. Some refused to believe a loving parent could ever be betrayed so deeply. Her daughter shifted between denial and collapse, at times insisting it was all misunderstood, at times admitting fear had driven terrible choices. Through it all, she stayed composed. She answered questions only when necessary and refused to turn the moment into a spectacle. She hadn't come for drama, she had come for safety and honesty. And while hearts cracked open around her, she reminded herself that protecting her life didn't mean she had stopped loving the person who had endangered it. There were moments when her daughter tried to rewrite the story, to soften the intent, to blame stress, to paint the behavior as survival rather than harm. But denial struggles in the presence of verified facts. Each time the conversation drifted toward excuses, the truth gently returned to the center of the room. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She simply repeated what had been found and how it had affected her. Eventually, the resistance weakened. What remained was something raw and painful: accountability. And although it hurt deeply, it was also the only place healing could ever begin. With professional guidance, protective measures were put fully in place. Clear boundaries, limited contact, communication handled carefully and only when appropriate. She followed every step not out of spite, but because the cost of ignoring warnings was simply too high. She made it clear that trust was not a door that could be pushed open with an apology. It had to be rebuilt from the ground up if it ever could be. Signing paperwork felt surreal, like acknowledging the end of a world she once believed unbreakable. But beneath the grief, a quiet reassurance formed. She was finally safe. Not everyone understood. Some relatives whispered that she had gone too far, while others insisted she hadn't gone far enough. Lines appeared where unity once stood. She stopped trying to manage everyone's emotions. That job had exhausted her for years without her even realizing it. Instead, she chose to stand gently but firmly in the center of her truth. Those who supported her stayed close. Those who didn't drifted away. It hurt, of course it did, but pain with honesty still felt lighter than peace built on lies. Consequences began to unfold, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. Her daughter faced difficult conversations, lost opportunities, and the uncomfortable work of confronting her own choices. Support was offered, real support, the kind that required accountability alongside compassion. Whether she would accept it was no longer in her mother's control. And that perhaps was the hardest part, realizing that love does not mean rescuing someone from themselves. Sometimes love means stepping back so they can finally see the path they are walking. Before I continue, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because what happens next will stay with you. Eventually, there came a day when separation became unavoidable, at least for a while. Contact paused. Silence replaced the daily rhythm of calls and messages. She cried quietly for the life she once imagined, for the version of her daughter she still longed to hold on to. But she also felt something else, the fragile beginning of peace. Distance wasn't punishment, it was protection for both of them. Because until truth was faced and change began, closeness would only reopen wounds. She promised herself that if reconciliation ever came, it would be grounded in honesty, not fear. And with that promise, she stepped into a future she never wanted, but finally understood she deserved. Healing did not arrive wrapped in clarity. It came in slow mornings where she struggled to get out of bed, in afternoons where a song or a smell triggered tears she didn't expect. She let herself grieve, not only the betrayal, but the future she once pictured. Journals filled with quiet thoughts, prayers, and questions that had no answers. Friends brought soup. Neighbors checked in. Slowly, she realized that allowing herself to feel the pain did not make her weak, it made her honest. And honesty, after everything, felt like the first safe place she'd stood in for a long time. She found strength in talking, truly talking, for the first time in years. A gentle therapist helped her untangle fear from guilt and taught her that boundaries are not weapons, they are self-respect in practice. Support groups reminded her that other parents had survived heartbreak too, and that loving someone doesn't mean tolerating harm. Each conversation stitched together a little more stability inside her. She stopped apologizing for needing help. She stopped explaining her choices to people determined not to understand. And in that shift, she felt her spine straighten again. The hardest person to forgive was herself. She questioned every memory, every missed sign, every moment she had chosen faith over suspicion. But slowly, she began to realize that trust is not foolish, it is simply human. Her mistake was never loving her child. Her mistake was believing that love alone could carry both of them forever. She learned to listen to her instincts again, to honor that small internal voice she had once ignored. And with each choice rooted in self-protection, her confidence returned, not loud or flashy, but steady like a heartbeat. She redefined what it meant to be a mother. It no longer meant sacrificing herself endlessly. It meant loving deeply while refusing to vanish in the process. She held space for her daughter's growth, but from a safe distance, where compassion and boundaries could stand side by side. If reconciliation was ever possible, it would require honesty, accountability, and time. Until then, she chose to love quietly without exposing herself to harm. Motherhood didn't end, it simply changed shape. Accountability continued quietly, meetings, plans, guidance from professionals. No revenge, no drama, just the quiet insistence that choices have consequences and that healing requires truth. She kept her world small and safe and allowed the process to unfold without forcing outcomes. The past could not be undone, but it could be acknowledged. And that acknowledgement slowly loosened the tightness in her chest. Life became softer. She tended plants, read books late into the night, and rediscovered simple joys, the smell of rain, the comfort of warm bread, the peace of silence that no longer frightened her. She built new traditions with people who valued kindness and steadiness. Her home finally felt like a refuge again, not a question mark. And every day that passed without fear reminded her that she had chosen well, even though the choice had broken her heart first. Looking back, she understood that love without boundaries is not kindness, it is self-erasure. She had walked through shock, grief, and betrayal, but she had also discovered strength she never knew she possessed. She learned that protecting herself does not mean abandoning others, it means refusing to disappear for them. One truth anchored her now: she could hold sorrow and peace in the same heart. And still move forward. And whenever doubt whispered that maybe she had been too firm, she remembered the words that began it all, the warning she hadn't wanted but desperately needed, and she thanked the quiet courage that allowed her to listen.